Thank you, members. We are now live streaming. Over to you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Paul. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Councillor Doris Jones and I am the Chair of the Planning Application Committee. Before we start the meeting, I must make a few introductions. The council members of the Planning Application Committee are the members who will make the decision and vote on each application. If it's possible, members, could you raise a hand just to identify yourselves to any members of the public or applicants that's in? A hand rather than a virtual, unless you're off screen. To clarify, would planning committee members, you've all raised, and is there anybody else that's not raised their hands because I can't see everybody? You have, fine, okay. Following on from that, we have the planning officer and a planning lawyer and a highways officer. Mr. Dave Coates is head of planning, development and environment. Identify yourself. Lisa Hutchinson is the principal planning officer. And we have an highways officer who is Mr. Who's the highways today? Is he with us?
Yes, Councillor, it's Mr. Howson.
Thank you, Mr. Howson. And then we have the planning governance lawyer, Mr. Andrew Errington. Mr. Errington. As I said before, I'm the committee chair. My role as chair is to maintain order at the meeting and ensure that the meeting proceeds in accordance with the council policy. In the event of the vote being tied, then I have the casting vote. Can I now take it to Paul? Can you do any apologies, Paul, please?
Yes, Chair. Would you like me to do the roll call for the attendance as we go through, yeah?
Yes, let's do that as well.
Yeah, no problem. OK, members, I'm going to read your name out. If you can unmute your microphone, and when I read your name, just confirm that you are in attendance at the meeting and mute your microphone once again, please. OK, first of all, Councillor Allen.
Here.
Thank you. Councillor Clark.
Present.
Thank you. Councillor Cousins.
Present.
Thank you. I've received apologies from Councillor Heslop. So Councillor Hughes.
Good afternoon, Mr. Dalton.
Afternoon, Councillor. Councillor Johnson. I don't have Councillor Johnson listed as being in attendance at the present time. Councillor Mrs. Jones.
Present, yes.
Yep. Councillor Keir.
Hi, Paul. I'm here. Thank you.
Hi, Councillor. Councillor Lee.
Yeah, thanks, Paul.
Thank you. Councillor Lister.
Hello.
Hi, Councillor. Councillor Marshall.
Hi, Paul. I'm here.
Hi, Councillor. Councillor McCollum.
Good afternoon, Paul.
Afternoon, Councillor. Councillor Tate.
Present.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Tosteven.
Yes, present. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Councillor Wallace.
Here.
Thank you, Councillor. That accounts for the attendance, Chair. Thank you.
Councillor Jones, you're still on mute.
Apologies. Can I ask members, are there any declarations of interest for any item on the agenda this afternoon? No. Can I then introduce you to the Assistant Director of Law, who will take us through the proceedings this afternoon? Mr. Errington.
Thank you, Chair. We begin with the Planning Officer presenting their report to members. Once they've done that, they'll also run through any further representations which have been received from supporters or objectors subsequent to the publication of the report. Then any ward councillor in attendance who's expressed an interest to speak may address members. Members will then be able to ask questions of the applicant and/or agent if they're in attendance. And just to clarify, this is an opportunity for members to seek clarification on facts rather than for the applicant and agent to make a presentation. The planning officer will then summarise the key planning issues. Members may then question officers, and members will then move to debating the application before moving on to putting forward a motion or motions on which to vote, and then take a vote and make a decision. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Jones, you're still on mute.
When we get all this over with, I'll be looking for mute. Mr. Coates, application, which is 182 Northgate, North Lodge, Darlington. Is Lisa going to do that? Lisa, can you take us through that?
That's me. Thanks, Chair. Good afternoon, members. Can I just check everyone can hear me all right? Thanks. OK, then. So yes, number 182 Northgate, and that's the first item on the agenda, page 7 of the papers. And members will recall that this was considered at the last meeting where no decision was made. So it's been brought back to this meeting for consideration and a decision. Members will have heard my report in some detail last time, and I'll go through the main points of that again for the benefit of members and those that weren't here. So the slide in front of you shows the general location of the application site. So it's on Northgate, just to the east of the A167. And if I can have the next slide, please, Michael. Thank you. So this is a closer shot. So this shows the property, which is the former Northgate Bedding Centre. Many of you may recall it, the property as that. So it's a vacant retail unit located on the east side of Northgate at its junction with Chestnut Street. It's located within the Northgate Conservation Area, and the United Reformed Church, which is a Grade 2 listed building, as well as the railings and gate piers surrounding the church, is located to the south of the site, just as identified on the screen. If we can just move to the next slide, please. So this is just an aerial shot of the site. And the next slide, please, Michael. So these are photographs of the site, and I'll ask you to bear these in mind as we're going through the presentation. So as you can see, the building is a 20th century redevelopment of the site. It's a flat roof 2-storey building, last used as the Northgate Bedding Centre. It was a retail use over 2 floors. The brick element you can see to the side in the rear, the ancillary sort of office and storage associated with that. So if we can just move on to the next slide, please. So this is the proposal. It's for a mixed-use retail and residential scheme. So the ground floor retail unit would be subdivided to provide 2 smaller retail units with 4 apartments to the rear. The first floor would be clad and would, as you can see on the screen, and would provide an additional 12 apartments, and then an extension on the upper floor to provide a second floor, and that would provide a further 12 apartments. Just move on to the next slide. So this is the ground floor layout. So that shows the 2 smaller retail units to the front facing Northgate, the 4 ground floor apartments, and then to the rear, accessed from Beck Road, are a total of 7 parking spaces for the flats, bin storage, cycle storage and parking for the flats. And then just to the bottom right of the screen, you'll see a delivery bay with bin storage for the retail units as well. So if we just move through the next slide. So this is a visualisation which has been provided since the last meeting, which just shows the proposal in context. So obviously an existing view at the top, and then showing the proposal in a visualisation in the context of the church and the street scene on the bottom 2 slides. So the powder-coated render cladding on the first floor and the extension above, and the agent has provided a further interpretation of that. If members felt that that the render wasn't appropriate, that they have put forward a proposal with a brick slip cladding for members' consideration, and that's shown on the next slide. If we can just move through that. So same shot again of the existing, and then two shots showing the proposal with a brick slip cladding. So if we can just move on to the results of consultation and publicity, Chair, and they're set out in detail on pages 9 to 10. So no objections in principle from the Council's Highway Engineer, Environmental Health Officer, Northumbrian Water or the lead local flood authority. And as I highlighted last time, the conservation area does have concerns about the impact of the proposal on heritage assets, and I'll expand on that as we go through. We've had 5 letters of objection, including one from the Friends of the Stockton and Darlington Railway, and those 5 letters in total raise the following concerns. So concerns about the impact on the character and appearance of the Northgate Conservation Area. The design of the proposal does not have regard to nearby historic buildings, impact on the setting of the listed building, not in keeping with the North Road Rail Heritage Quarter, a low quality scheme, too many houses in multiple occupation in an already overcrowded area, no evidence that the apartments can be well managed, too much pressure on already overstretched infrastructure. Why keep the shops? There are too many empty shops already. The homes are very small, which is not good for the health and well-being of residents. Insufficient green space and concerns about antisocial behaviour. We've had a comment or comments in support of the application, and that states that the design is deliberately contemporary and will be a spectacular feature in the Northgate Conservation Area, and that will also improve an important route into town. And there's been a letter of support from the Campaign to Protect Rural England, CPRE, and they are supportive of the proposal because they believe the conversion of the redundant building will provide much needed high density housing in the town centre, and it will also contribute to the number of dwellings Darlington is expected to provide, and therefore taking pressure off greenfield sites. And there have been no further comments received since the agenda has been published. So moving on to the main issues, probably fair to say that the main issue with this application is its impact on heritage assets. And as I've explained, the conservation officer has concerns about the proposed alterations and doesn't believe it to be appropriate to the character of the conservation area, and considers it would result in harm to the setting of the listed building. And like all consultee responses, these are carefully balanced and assessed as part of the overall planning balance. And while these comments are acknowledged, in this instance, there are a number of mitigating factors to be taken into account. As you saw from the photographs, the existing building is a 20th century redevelopment of the site, which has little or no visual interest or merit, and it's currently vacant. It's flat roofed, it's a two-storey building in a context of larger buildings, and it appears as a somewhat incongruous feature in the street scene against the backdrop of these taller buildings. So the proposed scheme with the second floor extension seeks to restore that relationship with surrounding buildings, and the upper floor extension has been designed with a degree of subservience to limit its impact on the setting or the appreciation of the adjacent listed building. The proposed materials, whilst a contemporary response, are considered to improve an existing nondescript building. So in terms of the NPPF, that does allow for where there is a degree of harm to be found to be caused. That allows a balance to be struck between offsetting that harm and weighing that against a number of public benefits. But I would say that degree of harm is considered to be at the lower end of the less than substantial harm. So in terms of those public benefits, these are considered to be the bringing a vacant building back into use. The retention of two smaller retail units on the ground floor is considered to be a more attractive prospect to other retailers or to prospective tenants rather than the larger retail unit that's there at present. The provision of residential apartments in a sustainable location, it's close to the town centre, it's well served by public transport, and also the provision of 20% affordable housing within the scheme. So within the scheme of 24 apartments, this would equate to 5 of those being affordable. So taking into account that range of public benefits, officers consider that would offset the less than substantial harm caused by the proposal, and is considered acceptable in this regard. So in terms of other issues, residential amenity, the properties on the site is on a busy road and surrounded by other commercial uses. So a noise assessment has been commissioned, and that identifies a range of measures to limit the impact of noise sources on the occupants of the apartments. And this includes enhanced glazing and a mechanical ventilation strategy. And there are a number of conditions set out in the recommendation at the request of the Environmental Health Officer, and they're conditions 13 to 17 in the recommendation, which, if members were minded to grant permission, would ensure that adequate or appropriate standards of residential amenity can be achieved. And there are also further conditions, numbers 8 to 12, also requested by the Environmental Health Officer, relating to the construction management plan, hours of opening of the retail units and delivery hours as well to protect the amenities of residents. Moving to highway safety, the retail units are to be served by a delivery area, an external bin storage, and there's customer parking available on nearby public play and display car parks, the nearest being on Garden Street and Beck Road, a short distance away. And the flats themselves are to have a total of 7 parking spaces to the rear and 12 cycle lockers. And as I mentioned, the site is within a sustainable location with good access to other means of transport other than the private car, and the level of parking provision is considered to be acceptable. I've mentioned before as well that the proposal will be eligible for 20% affordable housing provision, and that will be secured by condition 6 in the recommendation, so a total of 5 units. So just to conclude, this is a mixed-use retail and high-density residential conversion scheme in a sustainable location in close proximity to local shops and services. The concerns of the Conservation Officer are acknowledged and have been assessed, but in this case, officers feel that the mitigation measures, those public benefits, if you like, are considered to outweigh that harm. The proposal is a contemporary response to restoring its relationship with surrounding buildings, and officers feel on balance that's acceptable. Impacts on residential amenity can be dealt with by planning conditions, as I mentioned, and there's no highway objection to that. So the recommendation, Chair, is to grant permission subject to those conditions set out on pages 16 to 19 of the report. Thank you.
Councillor Jones, you're still on mute.
I thought I'd switched that off. It's not switching straight off. Is the ward councillor present for this? Would the ward councillor like to make any comments? No?
Yes, I'm here.
Thank you, Councillor Lister. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I can.
I am totally against this. I think it's just because we have an ugly nondescript building there now doesn't mean to say that we've got to have another ugly nondescript building. It is in the heritage area. Lots of people, although they haven't written in, have said, oh, it's horrid. You know, they don't want it. And there's a lot of work going on in North Lodge Park and so on to boost the heritage area and give us a bit of kudos in Northgate. And I do think that this building, whether it's cladded or bricked, detracts from everything. I'm totally against it. And also, I've spoken to Councillor Ali, and she feels the same. And she has spoken to members of her community, and they do too. So do you want me
I'm going to have this checked out because it keeps going on mute. Whether it's me wiggling the button, I don't know, but it needs checking. Members, you now may ask any questions if you wish to the applicant and the agent, but I must stress that it is questions only. And the agent in this case is Mr. Rod Hepplewhite. Mr. Hepplewhite, any questions to Mr. Hepplewhite, members? No.
Chair, it's Councillor Johnson. I did have my hand up to ask a question of the officers.
Thank you, Councillor Johnson. You may come in now.
Thank you. It's a question about the designation of the conservative area. How far down Northgate does the conservation area?
Yes, at the.
Hello.
Later.
Somebody's talking over me.
Sorry.
Hello. Yeah. How far does the conservation area go down towards the town centre? Where does it start? And there seems to be a mix-up between the conservation area and the heritage area, which is, I believe, was north of the bridge, and which took in the various railway attributes. So can somebody tell me where is the conservation area boundaries, and is there a confusion between that and the heritage area? Nobody can answer.
If I just, sorry, Chair. If I could just answer that.
Please say yes, please.
Yes. We don't have a map to hand, I'm afraid, showing the extent of the conservation area, but if we can maybe just go back to the aerial shot, Michael, which is number 5. So obviously in general terms, the so looking there, you can see Northgate, and it covers Northgate, and it covers the area to the west, which includes North Lodge Park and the properties heading along the A167 eastwards. To the best of my recollection, the boundary runs along Beck Road, so this is on the edge of the conservation area, but nevertheless within it. And in terms of the heritage quarter, again, we don't have a map showing that, but I believe Councillor Johnson, as you say, it's further north down towards the bridge.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. So therefore, we should not be considering this application in terms of the heritage area. We're concerned with the conservation area only.
Through you, Chair. Yes, the heritage assets we've identified are the Northgate Conservation Area, within which this is within, and the setting of the United Reformed Church immediately to the south.
Thank you, that's clear. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Councillor Marshall, do you have any questions to the applicant or the agent, please? Councillor Marshall?
Yes. Only one. Since the last planning committee meeting, I see there's been some changes to the proposed rendering, and there's an option of a brick cladding, which may be more appropriate. But there were some real concerns about the impact of this contemporary design on the conservation area. And at the last planning meeting, there were some strong views expressed. Has the developer met with our conservation officer to see what they can do within this design to make this contemporary design more acceptable within a conservation area?
Right, Mr. Hebblewhite, would you care to answer that for Councillor Marshall, please?
Yes, Chair. We haven't been able to meet with the Conservation Officer, but my clients, the applicants, picked up from the last meeting the concern that was raised by some with regards to the render. They had in mind that materials would be dealt with by condition, as is norm, and they weren't wedded to render, the proposed render, thinking it might be more acceptable given the adjacent properties, but also there's the use of brick in the area. So that's why they came forward with the alternative option, and that was submitted to Mr. Coates for some discussion, and Mr. Coates did indicate that there was some merit in using the brick alternative, but that would be put forward to members for members to make the ultimate decision.
Thank you.
Sorry, Councillor.
Mute again. Councillor Tate, do you have any questions, please, to the applicant?
Thank you, Chair. It's not really a question, it's just a comment. In regards to the additional pictures that have been provided, they're quite helpful. I think the white render itself doesn't work in that environment, especially against the church. So if I was to ask for a preference on the current plan, I would go with the brick slips. You're on mute, Doris.
Can you keep me off mute, please? I'd appreciate it. Lisa, would you like to sum up on behalf of the planning department, please?
Hang on, Chair. I have my hand up, I believe, I hope. Councillor Lee.
Can't see it, Councillor Lee. You've not, but I'll still take your question.
There are three things, really. Just on the subject of the render stroke brick area, Mr. Hebblewhite, is that there for design reasons or is it purely functional? So I'll give the other 2 points as well. In the construction side, are you taking much, will you be doing much to reduce the carbon emissions from the design, i.e. the council are looking at reducing our carbon footprint, as you well know. And a similar point related to the interior design, which is my limited experience in flats. If it's not designed right, if there's not enough sound insulation, it gets quite difficult for the occupants because they can hear all the doors closing, all the noises and all the echoes down the corridors. So will you be giving some particular attention to sound insulation to make the residents feel much more comfortable, much more happier in there? But I'd say the main ones really are, is the render brick design, or is it functional? Does it need to be there? Secondly, what are you doing as far as reducing your carbon imprint is concerned? And thirdly, will you be looking to put some sound insulation in their walls between the various flats? Thank you.
Through you, Chair. With regards to 3 questions, the use of render or brick, and that is more to do with the appearance of the building. Obviously, at the present moment in time, there are cladding panels, which we don't think are appropriate to the development now proposed. We think what is proposed would be improvement one way or the other. And with regards to the sustainable questions, the carbon emissions reduction, yes, the clients do intend to implement carbon saving measures as and when they can. That will be dealt with through building regulations application, making sure that the development accords with the approved document, LA1. And the final question, which has gone and passed me by.
Sound insulation, Mr. Hebblewhite.
That's right. Sound insulation similarly would be dealt with through building regulations application, and yes, there would be measures installed to the building to reduce noise emissions between flats, again as far as practicable.
Does that answer your question, Councillor Lee? Thank you.
It does, as long as obviously we maximise those sound levels. I don't doubt there are different degrees of sound levels that will be arranged, but it is important that our building regs just make sure that they maximise the heat efficiency and the sound insulation for the right reasons.
Thank you, Councillor Lee. Councillor Lister. Councillor Lister, you have your hand up.
Yes, I know, I'm trying to unmute myself. Thank you. Yes, can I move refusal? And I'm cribbing from Councillor Wallace's amendment last time, because I think it's, the best wording. So shall I read it out, or it's in the minutes, but should I read it out?
Yes, I think you should.
That planning permission be refused as the proposed development of this site by reason of its design and physical appearance would have a detrimental impact on the character and appearance of the Northgate Conservation Area and the setting of adjacent Grade 2 listed buildings, contrary to policies CS2 and CS14 of the Darlington Core Strategy Development Plan Document 2011.
Do I have a seconder for that, members?
Seconded, and happy to speak when you want to call me, Chair.
Now, Councillor Wallace, thank you. You may speak.
Thank you, Chair. I will certainly be supporting this motion from Councillor Lister. I very much agree with the comments as reported from the Conservation Officer, from the Friends of the Stockton and Darlington Railway, but also I think something that is very clear at this meeting that wasn't clear at the last meeting is that both the ward councillors and members of their community are also opposed to this application, and I do hope that will weigh heavily with members of the committee when they cast their votes later. I did a little bit of digging myself since the last meeting and just confirmed in my mind the previous building on this site before the bedding centre was the old police station, which was an important stone-built building. It was gabled. It had a varied roof line. It was very much in the character, sort of the 19th century character of much of Northgate. And I agree with, I say, both the Conservation Officer, the Friends and the Ward Councillors, that this building pays little, if any, respect to the church next door, the United Reformed Church, or indeed to other parts of the conservation area that are close by. And to remind members, this council is ambitious for the area of Northgate. It is run down. There's some really important heritage assets on Northgate, some of which we're about to spend millions of pounds upgrading with a view to the 2025 200th anniversary of the Stockton and Darlington Railway. Pease's Mansion, just a few doors down, is an example. So I think we do need to bear that in mind. I recall at the last meeting that some members, understandably, pointed out that the current building, the Bedding Centre, is empty, and it's a poor 1960s building. That's absolutely correct. I wouldn't disagree with that, and I will be glad when it goes. But that doesn't mean we have to take a building as an alternative, which adds little, if anything, to the street scene of Northgate. That building, the Bedding Centre, was there since the 1960s. We had it for 50 years or so. It's very likely the successor that we approve as a committee will have another 50, 60, 70 years on that site. And we should be ambitious for this site if we're genuinely going to begin a process of levelling up and raising the standard of architecture and streetscape in Northgate. And this building simply doesn't do it. So certainly I would suggest we refuse. I would invite the applicants to come back with a building that is more in keeping with Northgate. We're not ruling out anything on this site. After all, we're not ruling that we'll be stuck in perpetuity with the Bedding Centre empty building. We're simply saying this building, as proposed, is not good enough. And because I think otherwise we would as well be sending a message to other applicants, anything goes as far as replacement buildings and conversions of building on this important heritage area, conservation area rather, are concerned. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Wallace. Are there any further comments? Councillor Johnson, I see you've got your hand up. Councillor Johnson, I think you're on mute now.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I would propose an amendment to that the application is accepted. No one will be prepared to build something on that site which is in tune with the architecture of the church. I think that is pie in the sky. We should not bury our heads in the sand expecting such a building and ignoring a modern design. We are supposed to be a council which is looking forward. We have taken options in the past to have houses built which are of extremely modern design compared to the existing architecture of the town. They've worked very successfully, and I think just to anticipate that we get a church-like compatible building across the road from the church, I think is just pie in the sky. So I move the amendment, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Johnson. Do I have a seconded Councillor Johnson's amendment?
Sorry,
I'll
Chair,
second that.
Sorry, can I just clarify, is Councillor Johnson moving the officer recommendation as outlined in the report?
Correct.
Thank you, Councillor.
Do I have a seconded Councillor Johnson's amendment, please?
I'll second that.
Councillor Toscovin.
Yes, I'll second that with the provision that the brick cladding is the choice of material for the exterior.
Thank you. Councillor Kay, you've got your hand up.
I was going to second Councillor Johnson's proposal, Chair, but as it's now been seconded, I'll drop my hand.
Thank you.
Chair, I I appreciate this is, I shouldn't come in to make a fresh point, but I just wanted to correct something, a misapprehension Councillor Johnson is under from what he said about my motives for my hopes for moving the refusal, seconding refusal. I'm not anticipating a church, that we want a church building, one that reflects a church building here. There are many fantastic modern designs in Darlington and elsewhere. I'm certainly not opposed to modern architecture. I just simply think, and there could be a modern treatment here, I just simply think this is a really poor modern design.
You're still on mute, Doris.
I'll have to be kept off mute. We now can we now devote comment on the amendment, please? Any further comments and debate on the amendment that Councillor Johnson has moved? Councillor Hughes, you have your hand up.
Thank you,
Councillor
Chair.
Hughes.
Yep, thank you, Chair. My sympathies are very much with Councillor Wallace, but unfortunately, the less than substantial harm test is actually a very high bar. And unfortunately, it seems from the report that I've read and also the case law that I've looked at in relation to this, that we're not in a position to be ambitious about what we would like to see on that site. We're not in a position to question, you know, what sort of thing that we would like developers to come forward with, something more in keeping with our ambitions and that part of town. Unfortunately, with the less than substantial harm test, we have been presented with some things that the officers say we need to take into account. And really, less than substantial harm, there's a huge area, and to be anything more than that is almost impossible. So I reluctantly will have to be supporting the amendment on this occasion, not because I think that the building is anything that, you know, I could accept, and also the fact that the local councillors and the local residents are against it, and it pains me to have to support the amendment, but unfortunately the law and the case law is not with us on this, so I will be supporting the amendment.
Councillor Allen.
Thank you, Chair. The impression that I get from everything that has been said is nobody's objecting to the redevelopment of the building per se. We are all seem to be of the same mind that we're not particularly happy with the outside. And I'm pretty sure that there are enough different building materials out there that we could ask the developers to utilise to ensure that we all seem to prefer something brick, but the brick that they are currently showing is a very modern brick. If there was something else out there, I can't see the problem. I would therefore agree with Councillor Johnson and Councillor Hughes. Thank you.
Councillor Lee.
Thanks very much, Chair. I have a lot of sympathy with what Councillor Wallace is saying, because it's beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and I do have great difficulty with that swaths of render and brick wrapping around it. But what is difficult, I think, is trying to match a modern building in such a setting as North Road. The church, for example, you know, the height to width ratio of the church is completely different to the height to width ratio of this footprint of this new building. That in itself is a big difference. Then when you look at the buildings in and around the church and this new development, they do tend to vary quite dramatically from the cinema a bit further down to the restaurants and so on and so forth. So to be able to come up with a design which would try and unify and try and bring them all together, I would suggest is very, very difficult. So like Councillor Hughes, I'm persuaded really to go with the officer's recommendation. It will bring this building into use much quicker, and certainly for the 2025 celebrations that we hope to enjoy. It does take this building and it can be used again, whereas at the moment it's just falling down and will eventually get worse. So I think the sooner this building is replaced and rebuilt and brought back into use, the better. So I too will supporting Councillor Johnson's recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Lee. Councillor McCorm.
Thank you, Chair. Can I associate myself with the comments made by Councillors Lister and Wallace in this regard? I do appreciate the comments made by other councillors regarding obviously bringing the building into use. Certainly the comments from CPRE were entirely right. We do need to take the pressure off greenfield sites, and bringing brownfield sites back into use, extremely important. As Councillor Lee has just said, the importance of getting this right for 2025 cannot be understated. As we've seen from plans for the kind of narrative through Northgate, North Road up to the Heritage Quarter, it's going to be crucial, but I don't feel that this building meets that. I completely understand where Councillor Hughes is coming from with regards to the case law and with regards certainly where the Planning Act is concerned, the NPPF, and that the test is met. But we have design SPDs, we have conservation officers for a reason, and the considerations I don't think should be overlooked. I think while the design is perhaps not necessarily to my taste, I think in its setting, it still fails to meet the concern that it would erode the subservience to a very characterful building in Northgate. And as Councillor Lister has said, Northgate has aspirations, and we should move more in step with what Northgate needs and wants. And whilst bringing this building back into use is important and critical, it has to be the right development that reflects the character of the area, and I don't think it does. But I will leave that for members to decide when they vote. Thank you, Chair.
I'm going to ask Mr. Coates to come in and comment on what we've just heard from members. Mr. Coates.
Thanks very much, Chair. I am very interested in this whole issue of less than substantial harm, which is the point that Councillor Hughes has quite correctly made. It is a very broad church, a very broad spectrum of consideration, pardon the pun. At the highest level where substantial harm occurs, it's effectively the demolition of a Grade 1 listed building or demolition of part of Durham Cathedral. It's that level of harm we're actually talking about. Beneath that is the spectrum of less than substantial harm, which is a horrible phrase because it does indicate less than substantial harm doesn't really matter, and it clearly does. At the highest end of less than substantial harm, it still warrants a refusal of planning permission. That is quite clear. And at the bottom end of less than substantial harm, it is highly unlikely that we would ever justify a reason to refuse planning permission. Our opinion is that within that spectrum, it's not the top end, it's at the bottom end or towards the bottom end. However, if members did feel that spectrum or the judgment on that spectrum should be shifted further up, that in itself would be a reason to justify planning permission. But it is apologies for interjecting, but I think it's a useful thing to bear in mind that there is a degree of latitude here. Officers take the view that it's towards the bottom of the spectrum in terms of less than substantial harm, but members would of course have the choice to alter or vary that. Thank you.
Lisa, would you have any further comments on that?
Nothing further to add on the comments that Dave's made about the less substantial harm. What I would say is not wanting to speak out of turn, but if members felt that they wanted to go with the recommendation with the brick, that there would need to be an amendment to condition 4, but we can address that at the appropriate time if necessary.
Okay, if there are no further questions on it, I think we've got to move to the vote now. Councillor Johnson, would you like to read out what your amendment is, please? Are you to move the officer's recommendation?
I'm moving the officer's recommendation as per the report, Chair.
We're going to have to take a named vote on that. Paul, can you take the named vote, please? Paul Dalton.
Chair, I'm just a little confused. Councillor Johnson's moving the officer recommendation as outlined in the submitted report. Councillor Tosteven seconded the motion on the basis that they'd go with the brick cladding, but I understand, oh, sorry, the brick slips, but from what Lisa's just said there, it seems as though we would require an amendment to condition 4. Can I just clarify with Lisa, is that correct?
Yes, through you, Chair. Yes, condition 4 in the report at present refers to details of the render to be submitted for approval. So obviously, if members went with the brick slip option, that would need to be amended to reflect that.
Could I come in there, Chair?
Yes.
Would it not be possible to amend, rather than being specific to the brick option, that the materials of construction be agreed with the officers and the developer? And that might provide a little more security to the finished product that we all could be looking for.
Councillor Toskin, do you still second what Councillor Johnson has said? So we still have a seconder.
I do, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Paul, can we take a vote on that, please?
And to clarify, Lisa, do we have some wording around that, or?
I do, yes. Do you want me to read that out, Chair? So it would be to replace the current condition 4 with the following wording. So prior to the cladding of any of the external surfaces of the building hereby permitted, details of the cladding materials to be used, including the colour finish, shall be submitted to and approved in writing by the local planning authority. Thereafter, the development should be carried out in accordance with the approved details. And the reason for that would be in the interest of visual amenity.
And to confirm, Councillor Johnson, Councillor Tosteven, that is what your intention to move and second is?
Correct.
Before we go to the vote, Paul, can Mr. Coates come back on that, please?
Thank you, Chair. I'm just very mindful that my understanding is that Councillor Wallace put forward an amendment. Is that correct, Councillor Wallace?
Councillor Wallace put forward Councillor Lister put forward a substantive motion, which Councillor Wallace seconded.
That's correct.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And Councillor Johnson has in fact moved the amendment.
Chair, without complicating matters, it's Councillor Lee. At the last meeting, you might remember, I did object to the wooden fencing at the rear end. Could we put a condition whereby this is made of some kind of steel hand railing in keeping with that of the church?
Can I just come in there, please, Chair? Yes, we can amend the wording of condition 7 and being mindful of the discussions we had last time, I do have some amended wording for that as well, if you'd like me to read that out.
Well, yes, please.
Yeah, okay. So to replace condition 7 in the report with the following words: prior to the occupation of the development hereby approved, details of the boundary treatment to all flats with outdoor amenity space, including the upper floors, should be submitted to and approved in writing by the local planning authority. The agreed boundary treatment should be in place prior to occupation of the development and should be retained as such thereafter. And that would be in the reasons and the interests of visual and residential amenity.
Thank you, Lisa. Paul, can we now go to the vote?
Well, again, I just need to clarify where we are. Because Councillor Johnson's obviously moved an amendment which has been seconded by Councillor Tosteven on the basis that condition 4 would be amended. Councillor Lee is now presumably moving the amendment to that by adding a further amendment to a condition. So I'm wondering, does Councillor Lee need a seconder on that amendment?
I'm just taking clarification from the officers. Just wait a moment, please, Paul. Yes, Councillor Lee, you will. Do you have a seconder for the railings as opposed to the wood?
I'll second, Chair.
Seconded by Councillor Allen. Is that all to be included in Mr. Councillor Johnson's amendment as one amendment? Can we have clarification on that, please? Yes? You're all happy for that?
I agree with that, yeah.
Okay, Paul, can you move the vote, please?
So my understanding is that we are voting on the officer's recommendation with the 2 amendments to the conditions as previously read out by Lisa. And just to clarify, that was condition 4 and condition 7. Is that correct, Lisa?
That's correct, Paul, yes.
Thank you very much. OK, so I will take a vote if you are for or against or abstaining. Councillor Allen.
For.
Councillor Clark.
For.
Councillor Cousins.
Against.
Councillor
For.
Councillor McCollum.
Against.
Councillor Tate.
For.
Councillor Tostovan.
For.
And Councillor Wallace.
Against.
Thank you. If you bear with me a moment, please. OK, members, that's 10 votes for and 4 votes against. The amendment becomes a substantive motion.
Thank you very much. We don't need to vote on the substantive motion now, do we? That's it.
We do, Chair. We need to take a vote on the substantive motion.
We do. All right. Can we take a vote on the substantive motion then, please, Paul?
OK, once again, I will read names out, and if you can indicate that whether you're for or against. So this is the officer recommendation with the aforementioned changes to conditions 4 and 7. OK, so Councillor Allen.
For.
Councillor Clark.
For.
Councillor Cousins.
Against.
Councillor Hughes.
For.
Councillor Johnson.
For.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Mrs. Jones.
For.
Councillor Keir.
For.
Councillor Lee.
For.
Councillor Lister.
Against.
Councillor Marshall.
For.
Councillor McCollum.
Against.
Councillor Tate.
For.
Councillor Tostovan.
For.
And Councillor Wallace.
Abstain.
Can you bear with me a moment, please? OK, Chair, so that is 10 votes for, 3 votes against and 1 abstention. The motion is therefore carried. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you. Before we move on to the next one, can I ask members, please, if you will approve item number 3, which I should have done before this, which is the minutes of the last meeting. Everybody approve? Thank you all very much. Can we now move on to little B, which is Vantage Point site, Faverdale, Darlington, and I think Mr. Coates is going to take us through this. Mr. Coates, please.
Thanks very much, Chair. Hello, members. I hope you can all hear me. This is on page 23. And it's the erection of a 1,900 square metre supermarket, which in this particular case is Lidl, a retail store, which is Home Bargains, and a drive-through unit, which is likely to be Costa Coffee. It is a very long and rather complex report, but the actual principles we're asking members to look at are relatively straightforward, in my view. There are a number of material balances in its favour, and there are there is an underlying issue to support its refusal. And you'll see from the first page of the report, it's a very specific reason for refusal in terms of impact on Cockerton rather than the town centre. Next slide, please, Mike. That's the site. It's just on the entrance into Faverdale itself. you'll see George Stevenson Way and Westgate Crescent also marked on the plan. I'm sure members are also aware, just for clarity, that there is a consultation process that's doing the rounds at the moment for the site immediately to the south by Blackett, Hart and Pratt. That's for a large Tesco supermarket and other ancillary activity. But I'm just pains to point out that there's no confusion between these two sites. That site isn't being dealt with today. That's for another day. What we're talking about here is the Lidl site and associated activity, as you see on the outlined red. In terms of community involvement, members with a good memory will recall over a year ago now, I guess, that the developers for this site did engage with members. They came along to the town hall and ran through their proposals, and clearly members didn't make any commitment to do anything at that stage. It was just an information exercise, but nevertheless the important community involvement and council involvement process did take place. There's also been a lot of reporting in the local press, and the applicant has also carried out a number of leaflet drops in the locality. I understand Councillor Durham is here today. Yes, he is. And I understand he, as ward member, will be expressing a view on the issue. In terms of technicality, technical consultations, there have been no substantive objections to the scheme. That's the council's highway engineer, the environmental health manager, the ecology officer, sustainable transport officer, and indeed the senior arboricultural officer. There are no other objections from statutory bodies either. There was an outstanding issue, just in terms of context, in that there was a significant problem associated with flood risk on the site. There was an issue around achieving greenfield runoff, which hadn't been achieved on the scheme in its formative stages. Having negotiated this for some time now, the application has been with us for some time, it has been agreed that greenfield runoff can be achieved from the site, which is the place we need to get at if we're doing our job properly, and that will be achieved by appropriate attenuation tanks on site. So the flood risk, if anything, will be marginally improved by the development taking place. In terms of results of publicity and notification, we actually sent out 441 letters. There was a large, wide spread of consultation. We've also posted 4 site notices, and an advert has appeared in a local newspaper. So there are wide-ranging consultation processes that have been followed in the first instance by the applicant and followed up by the statutory process as part of the planning judgment of the planning application. As a result of that, 17 letters of objection have been received, and they're outlined for you, Chair, towards the top of page 28. If I can just pick out some of the more salient ones, there's obviously noise pollution, traffic congestion, impact and viability of existing retail and food outlets, antisocial behaviour in litter, increase in traffic noise. We've received 2 more objections to add to those 17 from a resident of Westgate Road, who again has concerns about the traffic impact of the development. And we've also had a letter from the developer at West Park, who's expressing concern about the impact on West Park developments and indeed Cockerton, which is in line with the officer recommendation. In addition, Chair, we've had responses from Darlington Friends of the Earth who have objected to the proposal. CPRE, the Campaign Protection of Rural England, also expresses concern about its proximity and its distance away from the town centre. And letters have also been received from Bussey and Armstrong and Estelle Cooper, who are developers, who have constructed the West Park development, which is just across the way and of course includes food outlets. We've also received an objection from Hillsdon Trust, who they're the owners of the property Westall Retail Park, who are concerned about the loss of an allocated employment site. We've also received letters from the cooperative group, who, as members I'm sure are aware, operate three stores, two in Cockerton District Centre itself, and an additional one in West Park. And they've objected along the lines of the retail impact assessment submitted by the applicant doesn't support their position to why planning permission should be granted, and it would have an impact on not only their stores and other stores within nearby district centres. I know we don't weigh objection letters when we decide to grant or refuse a planning application, but it is a significant matter I wanted to bring to members' attention. Notwithstanding the wide-scale consultation process we've gone through, there has been an unprecedented response to it. Notwithstanding there are some letters of objection, which I've outlined, there have been 85 letters of support to actually have the store built from nearby residents. I've also spent some time this morning going through some fairly recent additional letters of support to grant planning permission, and that's 41 additional letters that have come in. So by my maths, that's 126 letters of support from nearby residents wishing to see this application go forward. And the reasons they actually cite, again, Chair, if I may go through the more salient ones. The site has been empty for far too long. The retail offer, particularly the food retail offer in that location, hasn't kept up pace with the development or housing development in the locality, particularly bearing in mind the additional development that will be housing development will be taking place up there over the next 5 to 10 years. One point is that we'll be able to shop without having travel to Cockerton, and most workers in Flaverdale see this in a positive light. Another individual has said that the land is currently wasted. This would represent a massive improvement. It would be in walking distance from their home, which is a property on West Park. West Park is further expanding, which I've alluded to, and somebody else thinks it's a good facility, a diversity, a shopping offer within that locality, and it's an excellent use of a brownfield site. Another individual feels that it wouldn't affect the footfall into the town centre, our town centre, in any shape or form, and it would free up congestion in the town centre. The individual feels that Cockerton Town Centre isn't used, for want of a better phrase, the big shop. It's used for convenience shopping amongst other ancillary activity, but not used for significant monthly or weekly shops. Another point, which I'll touch on a little bit later on, is that a number of people do choose in this person's opinion, to leave the northwest of Darlington if you happen to be a resident, not to come into town or try to get across to Morrison's or other similar facilities, but they go to Bishop Auckland. They actually leave West Park. It's not a short cockstride away onto the motorway, and you can be in Bishop Auckland in fairly quick time, where there is a broader retail offer than currently exists. The other point I would like to make, Chair, is that this. Sorry, was somebody wanting to? Somebody off mute.
Carry on, Mr. Court.
Sorry, thank you. The other point I wanted to make is that this site is allocated for employment purposes in the local plan, and the hope historically is this site would be brought forward for employment purposes because it is immediately at the edge of an existing employment site. It is acknowledged, however, that this site has been marketed now for, the cleared site has been marketed for a number of years, up to 10 years, without any realistic prospect of coming forward. We also have a plentiful supply of employment land, so this particular site doesn't form an important strategic site for employment purposes. The other thing I would add in, Chair, is that the site is quite heavily contaminated due to its last use before it was cleared, and it would cost in the region of 1.4 million or thereabouts to clean the site up. The reason I'm mentioning this as a potential material consideration that members would want to put in the balance is that if the site did come forward for sheds, employment sheds, there is insufficient residual value to ensure that contamination would take place. And even though the fact it's been marketed for 10 years without success for employment purposes, one of the significant reasons why it hasn't come forward is because of that high figure associated to the cleanup, the remediation of the site. So to enable that remediation to take place, a higher end residual user would have to be put on site, and it's not necessarily a supermarket. It could be housing or something of that ilk. But in terms of the construction of sheds, that wouldn't release significant funds to enable that cleanup to take place. So that there has been a marketing exercise for 10 years, and I accept the fact, from a planning perspective, that one of the reasons, or one of the significant reasons why it hasn't come forward for development is because of the significant remediation to take place. It hasn't been accepted from consultations with our planning policy colleagues that it would be exceptionally difficult to bring forward an employment-based or B8 or B2 use on that property for those reasons. That's a kind of a summary of the one of the reasons, or the number of reasons, why members may wish to balance things in a particular direction. The other key factor is impact on accepted town centres or district centres. There is specific tests within the National Planning Framework which guides us on that. One of which is the sequential test, getting as close to the town centre as you possibly can be by using a more preferable site. We have engaged Nexus Planning, who are specialist retail planning consultants, to assist us on this issue, and they have considered that sequential test in some detail, which is in the report, the other alternative sites, and they're satisfied that there aren't any other sequential sites or sequentially closer sites to this one that we're actually considering at the moment. So that has been set aside. You'll note impact on the town centre isn't within the reason for refusal, and that's very specifically been framed or designed in that way. The second test in terms of satisfying the national planning framework is impact on acknowledged centres. And again, the very clear advice from our planning consultants, retail planning consultants, is again, because of the nature of Lidl, because it is not a destination shopping area, it's not, generally people won't travel 20 miles to visit a particularly Lidl store as they would perhaps a larger Sainsbury's. It's much more of a convenience and locally focused store, which would be fulfill a function in the location. So for that reason, he's concluded that it wouldn't have an impact on our town centre. But what he has concluded is that the case to say that there wouldn't be an impact on Cockerton hasn't been proven. Clearly, the applicant doesn't agree with that. They feel that from the information they have, and indeed, quite latterly, they've submitted a council's view on how our approach to this, and they clearly disagree with the conclusions we've arrived at, that in our opinion it would have an impact on Cockerton District Centre, and in all eventuality would result in the potential closure of one of the Co-op stores. So that is the balance we're asking you to consider, Chair, that there are a number of positive aspects to this, one of which is upgrading of an otherwise not useless piece of land, but a very difficult piece of land that requires significant remediation. It's an opportunity to prevent the leaching of some retail traffic going to Bishop Auckland and retain him in this part of town. So that would be good in terms of sustainability. But the overarching issue is the likely cause, based on our planning consultants' advice, of the impact on Cockerton town centre. Now, the national planning framework is very clear. It's section 90. It does guide us down a particular path to say where there is likely to be, or established likely to be, an impact on an acknowledged district centre. The application should be refused. Now, balanced off against that, section 38 of the Town and Country Planning Act, which we've spoken about on many occasions at the Planning Committee, does always, starting point is the development plan and what we should be doing. But the second part of it is, are there any other material considerations to lead us down a different path? And that's why I've spent a little bit of time outlining what those other factors are, Chair. I won't repeat them again. Hopefully I've made them clear enough. But the actual balanced decision of officers is that, notwithstanding all of those positive attributes, the advice we've actually received from our planning consultant is that it is likely that there would be an impact on Cockerton as a trading centre. Just as not in a lesser point, but just for completeness, Chair, we have received eco appraisals. We've consulted our colleagues in the County Council, who finds the appraisal satisfactory and has raised no issues. In terms of flood risk, I did touch on that a little bit earlier on, and we've managed to satisfactorily attenuate that runoff. So its greenfield runoff is now sorted. Northumbrian Water, the Environment Agency, haven't objected on that basis, nor has the council's environmental health officer. Whilst the recommendation is to refuse on that very specific reason, Chair, an impact on Cockerton, in tandem with our negotiations with the developer over some time now, we have discussed potential planning obligations, just in case which way this actual application went, and any planning obligations would include improvements to the Faverdale outbound bus stop, and that would be 15,000, and there would be a sustainable transport contribution to improve and maintain footways, particularly around the Black Path area, and that would be 52,600. To conclude, Chair, hopefully members will appreciate this is a balanced report, and I'm at pains to, notwithstanding the fact that the recommendation is to refuse on a very specific reason, I'm at pains to point out all those material considerations that are there for them to use or not use as they see fit, and that's very much dependent on, or is led by Section 38 of the Act, which allows members to look at the development plan and where that stands, and then also take into account those other material considerations if there's anything to lead them away from that particular position. So the application site is identified in the local plan as employment land. It has been marketed for 10 years or thereabouts. So it is technically a departure from the development plan. But I've also explained why, in my view, the site hasn't come forward for employment purposes. And one of the principal reasons, because it's heavily contaminated. And if the negative decision was taken today, in my opinion, in the light of that market exercise, it's likely that site would remain as it is for the foreseeable future. So there are two principal areas of which the National Planning Framework guides us down. One of which is the sequential test. That essentially, should this development be closer to the town centre than it is. Our very clear advice from our planning consultant Nexus is that having gone through that exercise, that's not the case. There aren't any sites closer to the town centre or in the town centre which would facilitate this development. So that part of the test is met, is satisfactory. But where, in his opinion, it fails is its impact on the adjacent district centre, which is Cockerton. The recommendation, Chair, is on balance recommendation, based on our retail advice, is to refuse planning permission, and it's listed on the bottom of page 52. Many thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Coates. The ward councillor, I understand, is present, Councillor Scott Durham. Councillor Durham, do you wish to come in?
I do, please, Councillor Jones.
Thank you.
And thank you and the committee for this opportunity. I'm obviously here today to speak in support of the proposed application at the former Vantage site, which is obviously in the Brinkburn and Faverdale ward. And I'm here on behalf of the residents of the Brinkburn and Faverdale ward. Now, I apologise because I probably will go over a lot which has already been said. But I think what you need to understand is that you probably just need some context. Really, as to why residents are wholeheartedly supporting this application, and we as ward councillors are. Now, between 2001 and 2011, the population of this ward grew by 41%, from 4,556 people to 6,410. Now that is a lot of mouths to feed, and up until 2 years ago we had no additional food stores to support this. And I know of myself, and I know of other people who've done exactly what Dave Coates mentioned. There is we've gone outside of the town. If we practically can't get from one side of the town to the other, we will go outside of town. We go to Bishop Auckland, and we will go to Aycliffe. We've spoken to residents over a long period of time, and the majority of us, have expressed real support for this development. And we've got to take into account as well, with the possibility of an additional 2,000 homes being built at Birchtree Garden Village, demand will only grow within this part of town. Being a ward councillor, but also being a resident, you know how people shop, and you know how things work in this area. Now, there's no evidence within the report that the West Park Retail Centre has had an adverse effect on the health of Cockerton Centre. Therefore, based on the similarity of the offering between Aldi and Lidl, I can't understand how an assumption has been made that the site will have an adverse effect on the Cockerton Centre. Being a resident and somebody who shops in this area, I do shop in Cockerton Centre, but invariably that will be when I'm using one of the additional amenities in that area. So it could be this chip shop, it could be the Greggs, etc., and it'll be used for convenient shopping. As Dave Coates mentioned, there are 3 co-ops within the area. Now, I can't comment obviously on the co-op's business model, but you would naturally have to question whether or not there is the ongoing validity of having all 3 stores within the area. Now, the report says that there's a likelihood that it will have a little impact on the local highway, and if anything, journeys to stores will be transferred, which will obviously be a positive benefit for the area. We've got to also take into account here that planning permission for a store on this site was granted in 2014. The store and the site will create 130 jobs for this area. As has been said before, £1.4 million is going to be invested to decontaminate this brownfield site. And there is the real potential that this brownfield site could be left empty for 10 years or more. We should be developing this site, and it should then act as a catalyst for further investment on empty sites in this area. The real positive benefits for people who live locally. It's going to provide an amenity with short distance for the local residents. It has 30 parking spaces for cycles, which will encourage healthy travel. And we're really happy that there is a possible contribution there to improve footways and cycleways nearby. As has been mentioned before, there is overwhelming support for this development from the residents within the Brinkburn and Furverdale ward. That has been reaffirmed to us with various phone calls and comments on social media in the last few days. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Durham. I'm going to bring members in now who may want to ask Marcia, who is the agent for this development. Can I stress this is not for debate, it is for questions only, please, to the applicant. And Councillor Allen, your hand was up first.
Thank you, Chair. I'll withdraw my hand for the moment because it's not for the developer, it's for Mr. Coates. So if I may ask my question later.
That's fine. Councillor Wallace. Question to the developer, question only, please.
Of course. Yes, thank you, Chair. In paragraph 9 on statement of community involvement, the report says due to time constraints placed upon the applicant to submit the planning application, the applicant was unable to carry out a formal pre-application consultation exercise. I wonder if the applicant could just clarify, were these time constraints imposed by the council? Because it's certainly very regrettable that we've not had the formal pre-application consultation exercise rather than the well, clearly, some people have managed to make representations to members of the committee and to the officers, but not everyone will have had a chance to do that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Wallace. Can I bring in the applicant, please? Marcin, are you there?
It's actually Richard. Yes, hello.
It's Richard, is it? Thank you.
It is, yes, no problem, Chair.
Okay. Sorry about that.
That's all right, no problem. Just to answer that, there's been a very comprehensive consultation. There's actually been 3 exercises undertaken with local residents. So it's been a very comprehensive, and as you're aware, this is over 2 years we've been looking at this proposal. So there's been plenty of opportunity for people to respond to this proposal and are still doing so as we speak.
I'm confused, therefore, Chair, if I may come back, why the officers would write in paragraph 9 that there's not been a formal pre-application consultation exercise. Either there has been adequate and satisfactory consultation with local people and local stakeholders, or there hasn't. I just wonder whether that could be clarified, please.
Mr. Coates, do you want to come in on that one?
Yes, Chair. Perhaps I can clarify that. Right at the outset, to my recollection, because this application goes back 2 years now, it has been with us some time. A formal pre-application process gone through with residents didn't take place. However, what did occur, as I'm sure members will recall, which I referred to in my presentation, the developers did come before members to explain in some detail their proposals, which are very, very similar to what we have before us today. And they have, as far as I'm aware, and perhaps Richard Hudson can confirm, that further leaflet drops and consultations have taken place over that period of time, whereas no formal pre-app with the council took place. It did in type and in kind by addressing members directly. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Hudson, do you want to come back in on that or not?
Yeah, just to confirm again, we have done 3 consultations with local residents, and that is the reason why we've had overwhelming support for the proposal.
Thank you, Mr. Hudson. I'm going to bring the planning officer in to summarise, as I see no further hands. Mr. Coates, would you like to summarise the key planning issues, please?
I'm sorry, Chair. I did ask if I could make my questions of Mr. Coates. So if you're bringing Mr. Coates back in, may I ask my questions now, please?
Can we do them where Mr. Coates has summarised, Councillor, and I'll bring you in next after that.
Yes,
thank you.
Certainly.
Thanks, Chair. I'm very conscious. You've heard my voice over quite a long period of time now on this, and I'll try to be as brief as I can. There are significant positives to this application, without a doubt, and there are significant bodies of people which has been supported by Councillor Durham, who actually want to see this. Balanced, well, in addition to that, the land is contaminated. It's unlikely to be used for employment use, nor is it needed particularly in terms of contributing to our employment land supply. We have other better and less contaminated sites. The matter does focus solely on the advice that we've received from our planning consultant. The planning consultant is very clear that this development would not have an impact on the town centre in any shape or form. So I'd ask you to move away from any consideration of impact on the town centre. And I know we all want to generate a town centre which is useful and vibrant, but making a positive decision here it isn't going to affect that. The reason is very much focused on Cockerton as a functional district centre. That's what we're talking about, and the invite to members is to balance all of those things up that we've gone through over the last 40 minutes or so, to see what their judgment is. It's my job to come to you with a formal recommendation, and that's what you have. And it's how much weight you place on that recommendation against the other material considerations you quite legitimately can take into account as part of Section 38 of the Town Country Planning Act. That's it. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Coates. Before I bring members in, I see that Mr. Hudson has put his hand up again. Do you want to add anything, Mr. Hudson, to what Mr. Coates has already said?
If I could, Chair, and thank you for that. Obviously, that there is this debate in terms of the retail impact, and I just want to highlight how, through the robustness we have done with the officers, we have provided the original application, which is in August 2018. We then did a amended retail impact in November 2018. In October 2019, we did health checks. And then further to that, in May 2020, we did another retail study, which incorporated a new household survey. Now, within all those amendments that we have done and revision of documentation, we also did health checks, and we did a health check on Cockington District Centre. And again, it showed it's a very vibrant centre. So we've got quite a lot of evidence that clearly demonstrates there is actually no impact at all to that district centre. And that, with the household survey, it showed that only 5% of the convenience spend is actually spent in the current area. So we've got a lot of evidence base that clearly demonstrates there is no impact at all. And we've presented that to the officers. And again, we've only recently, on the 17th of September, that's when we did a further health check on Cockington, and the results mirrored what we had done originally in 2018. So there has been absolutely no impact, and especially with COVID as well. And Kantar, who are one of the leading retail resources, have clearly said that actually in the Northeast, the co-op are actually trading even better through COVID. So there is absolutely no impact through the evidence base we have done that demonstrates it will have an impact at all on any of the local centres.
Thank you, Mr. Hudson.
Thank you.
Now, questions to officers, please. Councillor Allen, you're next. Do you want to question the planning officers at all?
Yes, please. Thank you, Chair. I've got a couple of questions and a couple of comments. I'll take them in the order I consider important. The first one is this a normal request that we ask of developers, that they should prove that there will be no significant adverse impact due to their development? Because it was quite convoluted. So do we normally request this?
Mr. Coates, do you want to answer?
Certainly. Was there another question, Councillor Allen, or do you prefer I took that one first?
It's up to you. Do you want to make a note? And I'll just mention, I've only got 4 in total. Okay.
I'll tell you what, can I answer that one first?
Yeah.
And then I'll come back to you. Yes, it is. For any development of this nature, the National Planning Framework sets out guidance to how we should approach these things. There's 2 principal tests, one of which is the sequential approach, which is to make sure the development concerned is as close to the town centre or in it, if it possibly can be. The second, which we've established, that's not within the reason for the refusal quite clearly. The second one is impact on other district centres, local centres, and the Apex planning. Notwithstanding, I appreciate there's a disagreement here, as it's not unusual between the applicant and ourselves, our officers, on what that impact would be. But your question was, is it normal or is it usual to have that assessment to be done? And clearly yes, because it is a requirement of the National Planning Framework.
Okay, thank you. My second point was Cocketton itself has a lot of residents, which obviously should use their little local centre. I also know quite a few people in Malden who also use Cocketton, but nobody seems to have taken very much notice of the West Park site itself and its future expansion, where again, my bugbear is we only ever seem to be building houses. We never seem to be building anything for the people who are going to live in those houses. So that's my sort of comment about what are we doing about the future. My third point, actually, no, that was points 2 and 3. My final is you did mention, Mr. Coates, about this particular site being in the local plan. Now, I understood that we didn't actually have a local plan in force at the moment. We have a draft local plan which is undergoing its representation stage. So that caused me a bit of confusion, if you can clarify that for me. And they're all the points that I have, but I do commend you on a very well balanced report. I was impressed.
Oh, thank you very much. The just to touch on the local plan issue, Councillor Allen, we do of course have a local plan. I know it's somewhat out of date. It goes back to 1997, but nevertheless there are certain saved policies and allocations within it until we get our new one coming along, which hopefully will be sometime, well, middle of next year. So there are certain policies which are still help us and guide us. And in the 1997 local plan, this site is still allocated for employment purposes. But as I've said in my presentation, because of the age of the local plan and the age of the allocation, sort of time has taken over a little bit, in that the site has been marketed for employment purposes for at least 10 years. And one of the reasons it hasn't come forward is because of the significant contamination on the site. And not suggesting that this is necessarily the right site to actually fill that requirement, but it would need a higher end residual user to actually pay for that 1.4 million contamination. So it's highly unlikely that any other form of sheds, employment-based activity would take place on there. So it is within the local plan. It's technically contrary to it, because this isn't necessarily an employment-based activity, even though people will work there. It's not in the normal factory or warehouse type category. So it is contrary to the local plan, but I've explained that element of the local plan is somewhat out of date, because it is a historical document, and the marketing exercise to sell it or to move it on for employment purposes is a more valuable, up-to-date guide, I would suggest, about the future use of the site, or the non-future use of the site for employment purposes. Thank you.
Have you finished your questions, Councillor Allen? Councillor Tate, you've got your hand up next.
Thank you, Chair. I've just got a few comments in regards to the application. The application itself has got the most support I've ever seen in regards to an application whilst being on this planning committee. I have only had residents contact me in the past few days to give support for this application. In regards to the objections that we've had, a large chunk of the objections have come from business. 2 of them, I believe, have come from the co-op. Now, the co-op have 3 sites in the area we're talking about. Ultimately, consumers should have some choice, and therefore the co-op shouldn't have a monopoly in one area of town because they've got 3 sites. All the time, as a committee, we talk about these brownfield sites, which are very difficult to do anything with. This developer is prepared to pay 1.4 million before it gets out the ground just to clear the site. Now, I don't believe that we would get a housing developer or even ourselves to pay that amount of money to then develop the land for housing. And I think that 1.4 million needs to be weighted quite heavily on any decision, because I just don't think that piece of land will ever be used for anything else. In regards to the impact on the Cockatton district, if we were to look at the Aldi and the M&S development, what impact have they had on that area? Because they're quite recent developments.
Mr. Coates, do you want to answer that?
Thanks, Councillor Tate. I acknowledge the issues around the usability of brownfield land. I fully accept that, and hopefully that's been made as clear as I'm able in the presentation as a material balance against everything else. In terms of the Aldi and the M&S on West Park, quite clearly from the information empirical information we have for the current operation of Cockatton, those two stores in themselves haven't had a substantial impact, in short, to answer your question.
Okay, and just one more, if I may, Chair. In regards to the letter that I assume all members got from the Hillsden Trust Group, which managed the site at Westall Retail Park, just in regards to obviously using that space, and I understand that it's about to become available because Pound Stretcher is currently in administration. Ultimately, this is nowhere near that end of town. It wouldn't make a difference to the residents in that area of town, because I don't think they would necessarily make the journey to that site. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Tate. Councillor Cousins.
Thank you, thank you, Chair. As the Cockatton Ward Councillor, I do feel, I'm very, very torn with this application. Part of me thinks that it's a great application, as Councillor Tate alluded to there, who would pay the money to clean up the site. Life isn't always about the money, unfortunately. Now, he also asked about M&S and Aldi. I have only been to those two places once, and that was because my son-in-law was able to give me a lift there when he wasn't working. Now, I use Cockatton shops all the time. Yeah, maybe it's not for a big shop, because I'll hands up, I do get home deliveries. And, because of not being a driver, but my residents on the Branksome part of Cockatton get the bus into Cockatton Village, do their shopping, and they're able to get the bus back up to Branksome. Now, if we were to lose one or two of our shops, now the Co-op that's near the Brinkburn Road end, well, that doesn't affect my residents as such, but it would affect the Brinkburn Road end residents. There is also a Co-op on Mowden. There's 4 within a very short distance, and so they will have a Co-op there. But if the Co-op, the bigger Co-op was to go in Cockatton or Heron, my residents would be very severely impacted on this. Therefore, I move the officer's recommendation for refusal.
Do you have a seconder for that, Councillor Cousins?
Seconded, Councillor Wallace.
Thank you. Councillor Clark, I think you said next, did you, that you wanted to come in? Have you anything to say on this, Councillor Clark?
Yeah, I have. You say it's a balanced decision, this. To me, it clearly isn't. When you weigh it up, you've got the residents that are basically totally for it, as seen by the clear support. Jobs of the creation of about 130 plus. A brownfield site that's being cleared at the cost of about 1.2 million, that was said. extra amenities for a growing population in the West Park area. And also it will reduce cross-town traffic, because coming from a retail background, customers do tend to shop in the same places. And I can guarantee there's probably people over the West Park area now going to either Aycliffe, Bishop Auckland or crosstown to Lidl to shop in Lidl. And we should be welcoming a top brand name, because the discounters, you know, are taking over really the country now with their offer with food shopping. And they are one of the leading food retailers out there at the moment, edging probably Aldi for popularity. The counter argument about Cockburn District Centre being impacted, it doesn't wash with me, because the centre will not be impacted apart from one store, which is the Co-op. And I'll be honest there, the Co-op probably will come under pressure. But having, through my retail career, had responsibility for that site in Cockburn, I know for a fact that that site is very difficult to maintain a profit. And it's had various guises over the years, and not one company have been able to make a real go of it. Now, the fact that Co-op have got 3 other sites within the vicinity would suggest that they're spreading the trade around. Convenience is a growing sector at the moment in food retail, so I don't believe that the convenience stores will be affected. However, once you balance it up, I feel that an operation like Lidl will have a real beneficial impact on not only the Brinkburn and Faverdale, but also the Cockburn area as well, because it's a matter of minutes up the road anyway. So they're my opinions, and for that I would not be going with a recommendation to refuse.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Marshall, you're next. Councillor Marshall.
I will remember to unmute in future.
I've guilty of it.
I've got a question, and then if I may, just to have a bit of a statement like Councillor Clark has. The question is, the material considerations here are driven around the impact assessment, the sequential impact assessment, and we have Nexus who tells us one thing, and we have the applicant's impact assessment which tells us something else. We are lay people on this. These are very technical areas. Why, if you can answer it quickly, why is there a difference between the 2 impact assessments if they're both being done with the same level of getting into residence, etc.? That's my question, and then if I can come back after that, Chair, with some comments.
Mr. Coates, are you able to answer Councillor Marshall's question?
Of course, Chair. Thank you. I suppose when you're actually considering something from the opposite ends of the argument, we're actually seeking to protect our district centre. And you know, we've employed somebody who is seeking to help us to do that. With all due respect, Aldi have that isn't part of their operation. They're not seeking to protect anything, and they're the opposite end of the argument. They're actually dealing with a self-interest. And that isn't a crime. That's not a criticism. It's just how businesses operate. So the reason why there's a disparity, Councillor Marshall, is I suggest that we're approaching the same problem from 2 completely different perspectives. We're actually approaching it from a protection, long-term protection, and Lidl are approaching it from a profit and a functionality as far as their business model is concerned. And I would say that is the significant difference why we take a particular view and it'll take another. I would urge that's not the criticism of Lidl or anybody else. It's just business mechanics. Thank you.
Mr. Hudson, I think you want to also answer Councillor Marshall on that. Mr. Hudson.
If I may, thank you. I think I can summarise this quite nicely. If truth be known, and no disrespect to Nexus, but they haven't been out to the site and actually checked it themselves. We've seen correspondence to say they went out in July 2019, and they are of an opinion that it may have changed through COVID. We've actually been out there and we've actually got the new evidence and up-to-date evidence, and unfortunately they haven't been there themselves. So for them to suggest that we are wrong or have a difference of opinion, we've got the most up-to-date information.
Thank you, Mr. Hudson.
Can I come back with a general statement as I requested?
Yes, Mr. Marshall.
I asked that question because that was one of the things that's confusing me. But could I just, as a comment, as a member of the committee, just say that I'm very sympathetic to Councillor Cousins' motion. I've gone through the application and I've tried to break it down into positives and negatives, and the positives are very much like Councillor Clark said. There are 130 new jobs. There's £1.3 million being spent on remediating a site which would not otherwise be remediated. And I've checked this morning as to the options for this site should this be turned down, of getting remediation through the Tees Valley Combined Authority Fund for remediation, and being told that that is primarily for housing sites, which is clear. This clearly is not. So that's something else that's out of the window. There's a strong support from local people, which has been evidenced by the letters that have come in. And this development, if it is approved, is definite. And from that being definite, there is a definite increase to the council in terms of business rates, etc., which we certainly need a presence. However, I've tried to balance against that the impact on Cockerton and everything else, and you know, there is a potential for job losses to offset the new jobs that would be developed on this new site. There's a potential for a loss of business rates if any of those businesses did close. The Co-op is regarded as an anchor site within Cockerton, and if that happened to close, or even the Heron site, then that could impact on the viability of other businesses being in Cockerton as well. And should those closures happen, there's a reduction in the impact of Cockerton as a community hub, and I think that is also very, very important. I think whilst we cannot, the sequential test that we've used cannot be set against our town centre preference under the local plan. I think that this it does make me think about the spirit of our town centre strategy and local plan for this sort of development, wherever possible, to be in the town centre. However, I take on board as well that should we refuse this, is the potential risk of an appeal and everything else. And I've really been torn apart by this application. It's a very hard decision to make, and I think I'm going to be driven by the fact that the job losses and close of business, but the potential job losses and potential losses of business in Cockerton Centre are potential. We don't know, and I asked the question about the sequential impact assessments is because one's saying one thing, one's saying another, and we have to rely on information that comes through, and I don't think we can rely on either to be fair. So I think that because of the definitive state of this application and the support from the support from residents, I'm tended to vote for acceptance of this. It's been a very hard decision. I think this is a very hard issue because I am concerned about Cockerton. Thank you, Chair.
Mr. Hudson, I think you want to come back in on answering that. Can you just briefly answer that, please? You're on mute, Mr. Hudson.
If I try and explain in a little bit more detail, clearly there was a household survey that demonstrated a lot of people are not shopping in the area, come what may. This proposal will claw back people who are shopping elsewhere, but it also will provide linked trips, which means even in the local centre, it will bring people back so they're not travelling distances to do other shopping. This has been demonstrated on numerous occasions where you bring a retailer like Lidl, it actually claws back people who are shopping elsewhere and actually demonstrates that they provide the link trick, so it actually enhances and improves local centres around it.
Thank you, Mr. Hudson. Councillor Keir, can I bring you in next, please?
Thank you, Chair. Well, I have to say I've listened to everybody. I really do see where Councillor Cousins has some angst. I've read through this report, believe it or not, twice, but just to try and get through the various paragraphs and areas of contention. And it basically, when I've looked at it, it boils down to paragraphs 47 and 49 to me, and that's where my judgment is. And I have to say that it has been very difficult, and I think I have taken a similar view to Councillor Marshall on this, where the balance and it's this term significantly adverse. So for me, that significant adverse being proved in respect to Cockerton, it falls for me. So in that vein, I would like to propose that we do not accept the council officer's recommendation and we approve the applicant's proposal.
Have you got a seconder for that, Councillor Keir?
I'll second that.
I think Councillor Johnson got in first. Can I bring you in to speak, Councillor Johnson?
Thank you, Chair. As the other speakers have said, it's extremely finely balanced decision, but I do appreciate the contribution made by Councillor Clark with his experience of a senior retail officer and actually working on that site. Actually settled my thoughts down on the effect on Cockerton. And I also clearly appreciate Councillor Durham's views on the local residents. So I'm not reluctant, I'm actually quite pleased to support an amendment to agree this application.
Thank you, Councillor Johnson. Councillor Lee.
Thank you, Chair. Well, like everyone else, it's to say it's a fine judgment is an underestimate. There are certainly a lot of advantages to be gained by permitting this development, but I'm swayed by the consultant's report. We've employed an independent consultant. I emphasize the word independent. I would disagree with David, Mr. Coates' point about coming from two different ends. I would suggest that Nexus, when they were employed, was to look at this problem from both sides, from developing it and refusing it. They're there as a neutral, independent consultant to advise the council on their recommendation as to what should happen to the site. And this instance, where they have looked at all the various considerations, their recommendation to our planning department is that we should refuse it. They have no access to grind. They've got to get no money from it. They're aware of all the advantages which Mr. Coates has outlined, and yet they're still going with that. Historically, we have been told both from this present government and previous governments that we should look very, very seriously at out-of-town developments, and this is an out-of-town development, albeit out of Cockatone development. Cockatone over the years, as someone incidentally who would benefit from this development living on the west of Darlington, Cockatone over the years has developed in itself into a nice little shopping centre which provides customers, provides people in Branksome and that west end of Darlington with a nice, very pleasant shopping centre with free car parking. To add to put this kind of development in jeopardy, and it makes no difference whether the co-op has one shop or 101 shops. That's nothing to do with this development at all. The point is, Nexus are saying it would affect the business there, and that in itself ought to be sufficient for us as councillors to protect it and not leave it and not put this difficult potential future whereby some of them won't exist. Now, as a councillor, we do put a lot of importance on our residents, and it has been stressed there. There's 120 odd of them who voted for it. But having been on this committee for a long time, and other councillors can confirm this, we've had in the past hundreds of people who have supported a recommendation, and we have gone against them, not deliberately, but because on planning policy, and it's on planning policy that we've got to make a decision on this. And it is difficult, but my leanings are towards an independent consultant who has got literally nothing to lose other than give the right advice based on their experience towards what could happen to the economy and business economy of Cockatone. And I, for one, feel we have responsibility to the people who are working there, the companies who have been paying this local authority an awful lot of council tax over the years, many of them been there a long time. And what does concern me is, heaven forbid that the nexus is correct, because what would happen then? We would exchange one derelict site, which is at the moment on the outskirts of Darlington, which isn't upsetting anyone, with other derelict sites, but this is in the centre of Cockatone. And Cockatone, I repeat, is a very attractive shopping centre for the people of Branksome and all the way around that, including Woodland Road and all that area. So, Chair, I would like to put forward that we accept the officer's recommendation in this instance and refuse it. Thank you.
Councillor Jones, you're on mute again.
Sorry, Councillor Cindy Hughes.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Councillor Lee, for that contribution, because that was part of the question that I had for Mr. Coates. I've got two questions, really. Firstly, in relation to decontamination of the land, that sounds very attractive to me, but I would just like to know that the land is currently capped and does not pose a danger to the residents in that area or users of that land. That's my first question. My second question is, Mr. Coates, you were at pains to point out the number of letters of support, and you warned us that, we don't weigh them, but, that there were the 85 in the report, and then you said there were more, so about 120. And I've looked at the bullet points in the report, and I don't really spot any, well, maybe one, that is a material planning consideration. And normally you warn us that, okay, we've listed these letters of support or sometimes letters of objection, and you tell us that, they're interesting for reading, but really, if they're not based on material planning considerations, we need to take that in mind, keep that in mind as well. So I've looked at those, and I've also looked at the objections, and I find many more material planning considerations in those. So the question about the land and the state that it's in currently, also the weight that we should be giving to these letters of support. And I would just like to say that in relation to Nexus, paragraph 50 makes it very clear that the council has sought independent advice from expert retail consultants. You know, I bow to my colleague Councillor Clark's life experience and professional experience, but with all due respect, we're not talking about competition in relation to the co-op. We're talking about vital services available to residents in the Cockerton area that may or may not have transport, as Councillor Cousins mentioned. So those are my questions. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Toscovin. Sorry, Mr. Coates wants to come in and answer that, Councillor Hughes.
Yeah, thanks for the questions, Councillor Hughes. Just if I take the first one first, the reason I raised the issue around contamination of the site, because it is an opportunity to do something about it. It's not the sole determining factor. It's an area that I was asking members to consider in the overall balance. But I think the key part of your question relates to whether it's effectively capped off and it's safe for residents, and yes, it is. It doesn't present any problems. The reason I mentioned it is because it is an opportunity. It's not the sole determining factor, but it's an opportunity to move forward with development. In terms of letter of report, letters received rather, you're quite right. I did emphasise the fact that we, in the planning system and in a sort of determination process, we don't weigh letters. Hopefully we do the right thing. I think that's the key thing. And whilst I do fully appreciate that there are an unprecedented amount of letters that are submitted, a number of them do just say, I support this proposal because I'd quite like it here. And that's a perfectly legitimate view to take as a resident. And if I was a resident, I may well say the same thing on a similar issue. But what a resident would like to see, and what goes to the heart of planning policy, and the planning policy is something that we're at pains to have gone through a process with a very competent retail planning expert, and which is reflected in our recommendation, Councillor. And we have gone through a tortuous process looking at this, and I've been at pains to point out all the material positive reasons members can look at, but nothing I've heard today has moved me away from the recommendation that in terms of balancing the positives that we've rehearsed now against impacts, which is a requirement of the National Planning Framework, the balance is clearly in favour of the recommendation, and I would continue to support that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Coates. Councillor Toscovin.
Thank you, Chair. I was obviously being moved by all the representations that have been made this afternoon, and particularly in terms of Cockerton and its potential impact. But in the last application, we looked at the National Planning Policy Framework, and we weighed it up in terms of harm and public benefits. Now, I think Councillor Clark clearly outlined the public benefits of approving this application. And I don't think you could dispute any of those at all. In terms of harm to Cockerton, what we have is a situation that may or may not occur. And we haven't seen any impact from Marks and Spencer's and Aldi, who have developed and been in operation now there for some time. And so it's only speculation, really, in terms of what we may or may not see in terms of Lidl. And therefore, I don't think we can say that we look to say that the potential harm outweighs the public benefits, because we don't know for a fact that this potential harm will occur. And the only evidence we've got so far in terms of other stores is that it hasn't occurred. And therefore, I would suggest that we approve this application and refuse the officer's recommendation on that basis. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Tuskman. Councillor Johnson, did you want to come in? I think you're on mute, Councillor Johnson.
Apologies, Chair. No, my question's been answered.
Thank you. Councillor Cousins, I think you're the final hand.
Right, just thank you, Chair. I know I've already spoken and moved the office's recommendations, but there's a couple of things I would like to ask. Just one of them is about the people, the residents on Westgate Crescent. I wondered if any of the letters of support were from those residents. And the second thing is where the applicant, Mr. Hudson, said about the consultation. Now, I know I was a bit confused a few days ago about these applications, because both my daughters, one lives on Branksome, one at the other part of Cockerton, and myself, we've all received the forms from Tesco, the application for the Tesco, the next site. None of us received anything for this one. So, there wasn't a great in-depth consultation went out, where the applicant said there was a lot of leaflets went out. We didn't receive anything. But that's my two questions. That's my 2 points.
Comments. Thank you, Councillor.
Comments. Well, one question, one comment.
Okay, Councillor McCollum, I think you've got your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Chair. It was a straight question to Mr. Coates. If such a proposition were to occur for this site, but could demonstrate that the application, the proposal would not have significant adverse impact, that would go through, honestly, if it had the evidence to show. But obviously it doesn't meet officer's recommendation. Is it the case that a similar proposition that could demonstrate no impact would be supported by this authority?
Thanks, Councillor McCollum. Yes, is the short answer for that. The two tests, the sequential one, which we've acknowledged has been accepted, there isn't an issue there. It's and there's no impact on the town centre. Again, our independent advice has confirmed that. It's solely on this issue of impact on Cockerton, and the case in that particular case, it's not proven, and the recommendation reflects directly the advice that we've received. And I do accept Councillor Tossavent's point to say, well, we don't truly know what the impact would be, but I suppose in any form of development, we don't know exactly empirically what an impact will be till it occurs, and our best efforts can only be to assess things as best we're able, and the best way of assessing things is having independent advice, and that's what we've taken. So I do fully accept that it's not empirical evidence where you can point to something and say that is what will happen. It's an educated professional guess, for want of a better phrase. I accept that, but it's the best evidence we have, and quite clearly the National Planning Framework requires us to do that. It requires us to go through that process and make our best judgment based on the information that we have. It would be great to have a crystal ball to actually build this thing and then, oh, it has an impact. I tell you what, let's take it down again. But clearly life isn't like that. So we do need to make an assessment on the best information we have. And I genuinely believe the process we've gone through whilst clearly there's disagreement with the various contributors, the process we've gone through has come to a certain conclusion, and that conclusion is, in my opinion, very fairly and balanced representation within the report.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Coates. Now I've got Councillor Allen and Councillor Lee. Is it a question that you both want to ask again? If so, I'll bring in Councillor Allen first, but please, it's got to be a question to the planning officer. Councillor Allen.
Thank you, Chair. At the pre-planning presentation that we had last year, a lot was made of the fact that if a development of this kind was allowed and went through, car usage would be dramatically reduced because people weren't going to be trying to drive through the town centre and clogging up, and therefore carbon emissions would be lower. Also, the financial side would be people wouldn't then feel the necessity to drive out of that end of Darlington. Therefore, we'd be keeping the money, the spending money within Darlington. But my question would be, if this application was refused on your recommendation, do you have any proposals whatsoever to build car parking in Cockerton to accommodate all the new people that you are building homes for, who their closest shopping area would be Cockerton? Thank you.
To come back, Councillor Allen, I just noticed, Chair, beg your pardon, Councillor Allen, I'll come back to you in 1 second. There was an unanswered question from Councillor Cousins, which I'll perhaps
Beg
need
your
to go
pardon,
back to.
Councillor Cousins, yes, please.
And
Do you want to
I'll
answer
come.
Councillor Cousins?
Yeah, Councillor Cousins, just to clarify what that question was, if I may.
Yeah, it was just to check if some of the letters of support or even opposing the application
Yes.
were from the residents of Westgate Crescent.
There is to answer that, Councillor Cousins. That's fairly straightforward. It's a mix. There has been a number of people in support who live on Westgate Road and the adjacent areas. There has been a small number of people who wish to object, but there's overwhelming support, as reflected in the letters. What I would add at that point is as a complete the answer, and it relates back to Councillor Cindy Hughes' point. Again, we whilst there's a number of letters of support, which I know there's a degree of pressure to say, well, let's do what people want to do. I think our responsibility here is to take a broader view, if I may offer, and to actually look at planning policy, which is what really we're obliged to do. So whilst, yes, there are some objection letters from Westgate, there are some letters of support as well. But I think moving away from what people would like to see, which is a tempting thing to do, we do have a broader responsibility, I would suggest, to look at planning policy, and more particularly the advice that we've received. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Lee, then it's Councillor Clark, and then I am going to wind up questions after that because I think it's been well aired. Councillor Lee, then Councillor Clark.
Yeah, I won't be very long, Chair. Thank you for that. But just to remind people, it is done by independent consultants. It is being supported by a national planning policy framework. And I'm going to put the spanner in the works, and I'm going to say this very quickly before Mr. Coates stops me. What is, if this goes through, those who are recommending that they go against Office's recommendation are suggesting that we're not going to have very little damage to Cockerton. Standing in line is Tesco. If this is approved, Tesco will automatically have to fall. And if Tesco builds, in addition to Lidl, mark my words, not only Cockerton will suffer, but Darlington Town Centre will suffer. I appreciate, in my experience, that we're not supposed to look at something which is, we can only look at the stuff on the table, but please give that some deep thought. You may accept little, but what's coming next is far greater and a much far greater effect on the town centre and far greater on the effect of Cockatone and indeed on the town centre.
Sorry, Councillor Lee, but that is not material, and I don't think we can take that into account. Do you want to come in any further? We can't discuss Tesco at this stage.
Very, very briefly, Chair, for me. I do acknowledge Councillor Lee's question, but we can't make any judgments on the Tesco application. That is something members, I'm sure, are aware that there is an application in for Tesco's on the other side of the road, but it is two completely separate issues. We'll come to that on another day, but we can't cloud the two. I don't think doing anything in particular with either for or against the Lidl application in any way affects the determination of the Tesco application. They are two quite separate things and quite separate decision-making processes.
Thank you. Councillor Clark, I think I said you next. Beg your pardon, Councillor Clark.
It's really directed at Dave. I'm just of the opinion that the independent consultant report that there's going to be damage to Cockatone Centre, as they call it, is flawed. A food retail outlet will not affect trade for Greggs, a hardware store that's in Cockatone, a hairdresser's that's in Cockatone, a post office that's in Cockatone, a takeaway that's in Cockatone, a chip shop that's in Cockatone. The only effect it will have is on another food retail business, which is a co-op. So, and as I've said before, that unit has been under different guises all through the years. The food retail sector is currently undergoing a condensation of sites, to put it mildly, where if they're not viable, they'll shut them. And there's a host of the big companies, Sainsbury's, Tesco's, Co-op even, that are going through this process where if they identify a site that isn't viable, they will shut it. Retail is a ruthless business. Now, we don't know if that Co-op will be there in 6 months' time due to the current situation in food retail, where the discounters are having a big effect on some of these outlets. So if it's on the proposal that really is only affecting the co-op, well, the consultation that you've had that's been done indicates it is going to affect all of Cockatone Village, and it isn't. And that's just common sense. It is not going to affect the businesses that are in Cockatone, apart from one, which is a food retail outlet. And that could close anyway. So, well, that's all I've got to say on that. In my opinion, is it's absolutely flawed, the report that you've had back.
Thank you. Councillor Allen.
Thank you, Chair. It's just to repeat my question that Mr. Coates didn't actually have time to answer last time, which was if we refuse this application, all the people that live and will live up in that northwest area, if we want them to shop locally, Cockatone is their only alternative. There simply isn't room, in my opinion, for people to shop in the numbers required because there's no car parking. I've been there. It's absolutely awful. And I honestly, in my opinion, I don't think this would make that much difference to Cockatone because they have so many people and so many people from Mowden who walk into Cockatone to do their shopping. I can't see that a Lidl and a Home Bargains will make that much difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Allen. I'm going to bring it to a close as far as debate goes, and I'm going to ask Mr. Coates to sum up once more, please. There are no further questions, are there?
Mr. Coates, you were on mute.
Can we just go to the vote?
I'm going to... There are no more questions from members because there are no more hands showing. Somebody's got me... Somebody's got me echoing. I think there's nothing more can be said. Mr. Coles, do you want to say any more on this?
No, thank you, Chair. I think I have summarised the main issues, and I've offered members the other material considerations that they may or may not wish to take into account in terms of Section 38, the other material consideration bit, and the balance, as far as I'm concerned, is within the officer report, and the material considerations, which I think we've all rehearsed pretty comprehensively now, still don't change the officer recommendation, Chair. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, I'm going to take it now to the vote. I'm getting radios and telephones and mobile phones and all sorts going on in my microphone, which makes it very difficult. So can you please turn off any background noise, members, and let's just take this to the vote. It's been moved by Councillor Kay and seconded by Councillor Johnson that we do not accept the recommendations of the officer and that we vote in favour of the Liddell application. Can we take a named vote on that, please, Paul?
Yes, Chair. If I can clarify one point before we do go any further on this vote. I understand that we can only vote as it being minded to grant, as there are no conditions currently on the table. Can I just confirm with Mr. Coates or Mr. Errington that we would be seeking to come back to the next meeting if members were minded to grant to consider the conditions?
I think we would.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, thanks, Paul. It's something that we've discussed with the chair, depending on the outcome of what happens today. If members were minded to grant planning permission, whilst there are in the presentation I did mention some negotiations had taken place regarding 106 and other matters. But what I would hope that members would agree on was that if they were minded to grant planning permission, there would be an instruction issued that we go away, or I go away, and come back next time with an appropriate list of conditions which we'll bring back to members to ensure that that's what they were looking for. Because as you appreciate, if permission was granted, there would be a raft of conditions that would be attached to any approval, and rather than rush through them here and now, I think it'd be more appropriate to come back on another day. So if members were minded to go down that particular route, my suggestion would be it would be a minded to approve with an instruction for officers to come back with an appropriate set of conditions. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Kay and Councillor Johnson, are you both happy with that? Councillor Kay?
Yep, I'm happy with that situation, Chair.
I agree.
Thank you. In that case, Paul, can we put that into it and vote on that with the suggestions that's been made by Mr. Coates?
Yep, so just to clarify where we are, we had a substantive motion that was moved by Councillor Cousins, seconded by Councillor Wallace to approve officer recommendation. We then had an amendment from Councillor Keir and seconded by Councillor Johnson, which is to vote as minded to grant and with an instruction to officers to come back to the next meeting for consideration of conditions. Okay. Obviously, we have an amendment on the table, so we'll take the amendment first. I will take a named vote. And again, if you can indicate whether you are for, against or abstaining on the amendment as moved by Councillor Keir and seconded by Councillor Johnson. Councillor Allen.
For.
Councillor Clark.
For.
Councillor Cousins.
Against.
Councillor Heslop is not with us today. Councillor Cindy Hughes.
Against.
Councillor Johnson.
For.
Councillor Mrs Jones.
For.
Councillor Keir.
For.
Councillor Lee.
Against.
Councillor Lister.
Against.
Councillor Marshall.
For.
Councillor McCollum.
Against.
Councillor Tate.
For.
Councillor Tosteven.
For.
And Councillor Wallace.
Against.
If you bear with me a moment, please. Okay, so we have 8 votes for the amendment, 6 votes against. The amendment is carried and therefore becomes a substantive motion.
Thank you. Can we now vote on the original amendment, which was Councillor Cousins, I think, wasn't it? Yes.
No, Chair, that's fallen off the table. The amendment was carried, so that becomes a substantive motion. What we need to do now is either move to a vote on the new substantive motion,
Okay.
unless there's anything else from members.
No, take a vote on the new substantive motion, Paul.
Okay, that's fine. So the substantive motion before members then now is that we are minded to grant with an instruction to officers to come back to the next meeting with consideration of conditions. Okay, so again, Councillor Allen, please.
For.
Councillor Clark.
For.
Councillor Cousins.
Against.
Councillor Cindy Hughes.
Against.
Councillor Charles Johnson.
For.
Councillor Mrs Doris Jones.
For.
Councillor Kia.
For.
Councillor Lee.
Against.
Councillor Lister.
Against.
Councillor Marshall.
For.
Councillor McCollum.
Against.
Councillor Tate.
For.
Councillor Tosteven.
For.
And Councillor Wallace.
Against.
And again, if members just bear with me, please. Okay, the substantive motion was 8 votes for, 6 against. The motion is carried. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. So that's it. The motion has been carried and the application has now been approved. Thank you very much, members. It's minded to approve. We'll be back with the conditions at the next planning committee meeting. Thank you. There are no supplementary items of part 1. Are there any part 1 questions? No. Can we move on to part 2? Part 2, can we take that on block unless anybody has anything particular they want to highlight in there? No. Okay, that now takes us to part 3. It's recommended that pursuant to section 100B brackets 5 of the Local Government Act 1972, that all the public be excluded from the meeting during the consideration of the ensuring item on the grounds that involves the likely disclosure of exempt information as defined in exclusion paragraph 7 of part 1 of schedule 12A of the Act. Can we now have a 5-minute recess to give the time to